This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories that we're tracking for you today. First up, Dr. James Galbraith joins me on today's show to talk about predator states, which also happens to be the title of his new book. Then outspoken British politician Nigel Farage gives Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras a proverbial smack. You won't want to miss it, it's pretty funny. And in today's big deal, Ed Harrison and I talk mismanagement, misuse, and abuse of government funds. It's all coming up, and it all starts right now. Politician and UK Independence Party leader Nigel Farage has never been called a wallflower. And in a strongly worded speech to the European Parliament on Wednesday, Farage made his views on the EU's president, Greek Prime Minister Antonis Samaras, explicitly clear. Take a look.
And you come here, Mr. Samaras, and you tell us that you represent the sovereign will of the Greek people. Well, I'm sorry, but you're not in charge of Greece, and I suggest you rename and rebrand your party. It's called New Democracy. I suggest you call it No Democracy, because Greece is now under foreign control. You can't make any decisions. You've been bailed out, and you've surrendered democracy, the thing your country invented in the first place, and you can't admit.
Whew. Now, during the diatribe, he argued that people don't want a United States of Europe, but a Europe of sovereign states, trading and working together. Farage also said the European elections would mark a watershed in the battle for national democracy. Elsewhere, some economists are predicting an approaching oil glut, which they say may push the global economy into deflation. Deutsche Bank estimates that crude oil is now the most richly priced commodity in the world. America is on track to overtake Saudi Arabia as the top global producer of oil by 2016. And this year, the U.S. accounts for more than half of the world's non-OPEC oil supply. U.S. shale will add 1 million barrels a day to the global supply, while Libya will also increase shipments. And now with Iran coming out of hibernation, some believe that this will push OPEC's standby capacity to levels not seen since the depths of the financial crisis in 2009. The U.S. Energy Department says U.S. oil imports will drop 5.5 million barrels by next year, turning the world's 89 million barrel a day market right on its head. Now, those bullish on oil say that the global economic recovery is strong enough to soak up rising supplies. And finally, federal regulators are already easing off the gas on the Volcker rule. This after the American Bankers Association threatened to sue. Federal regulators say that they will now allow smaller banks to hold certain CDOs of trust-preferred securities. The ABA said the provision would have forced 275 smaller banks to take a $600 million hit to capital. The change would apply to any bank with assets under $15 billion. Well, there you have it. As always, we'll be tracking these headlines and keeping you posted on all the latest. Professor Galbraith, who teaches economics at the University of Texas, is the son of John Galbraith, author of The Great Crash of 1929 and a must-read for economic historians. Now, when we last spoke to James Galbraith in November, our interview sparked huge interest, but also huge questions. Questions about national solvency and sovereign default. So when and how exactly did national solvency become an issue? Earlier today, I spoke with Dr. Galbraith about the national solvency issue and about his book, The Predator State. I started our conversation by asking him about fiat money, legal tender without any intrinsic value, and I asked him where specifically fiat money derived its value. This is what he had to say.
Well, I'm not aware of any significant economy that does anything else anymore. Money is a part of, generally speaking, national economic systems, and it gets its authority from the from the state, from the promise that it is legal tender and that you can use it to retire any debt that you may have, whether a private debt to another individual or company or a debt to the state. What you can use it to pay your taxes.
Now, is fiat money's position as the only legal tender within an economy important to maintaining its value as a medium of exchange?
Yes, of course. It is the foundation of that value, essentially, yes.
Can you expand upon that a little?
Well, if you were not able to use your national currency to pay debts that were contracted in a particular country, then there would be very good reason to go and hold somebody else's currency. You might expect that there would be a general flight from your national currency into another country's. And that would cause problems, and does cause problems for countries where there is some doubt about either the stability of the currency or the willingness of the rest of the world to hold it.
That actually leads well to my next question. What about money as a store of value? Now, if citizens lose faith in government, won't they turn away from state money as a store of value altogether, thus eroding the value of fiat money?
It can happen, sure, and it does happen. It happens in particularly in countries that are not large economies in the world system, because they have their citizens who have the option of holding their wealth in other countries' assets. And so it's a system which tends to benefit the largest and wealthiest countries at the expense of some of the others.
Now, I'm going to read a passage from your book, The Predator State. Now, you write, quote, "A coalition of relentless opponents of the regulatory framework on which public purpose depends, with enterprises whose major lines of business compete with or encroach on the principal public function of the enduring New Deal." Now, I got to ask you, would you explain this quote to me?
Okay. The major argument of that book, and the case that I'm making in that quotation, is twofold. One is that our economy is built around public institutions that were created in the 20th century in two big waves. One of them in the New Deal. And that was Social Security and other institutions like the minimum wage and the Fair Labor Standards Act and a great many other things that gave us the modern American government. And the second wave was in the 1960s, mainly under Lyndon Johnson, when we began to get major elements of the health insurance, Medicare, and Medicaid, and quite a number of other things that we needed at that time. And those institutions are often treated by economists as being supporting structures, peripheral, if you like, to the core function of the economy. But I would argue that in the world in which we live, retirement security and health security and basic public infrastructure are central institutions of economic life. They're fundamental to the way we function and interact with each other. And one of the things that we observe in what I call the predator state is that a lot of our politics turns on private entities who are historical enemies of these institutions and who would like to see them rolled back, or who would like to see them redesigned so that particular private sector entities can make additional money out of them. And one can see this in the way in which recent additions to the social structure, Social Security system have been managed. An example of this is Medicare Part D, which came in the Bush administration, which was a drug benefit, itself a significant extension to the system of social protections, but designed in a way that it made it very, very lucrative to the big pharmaceutical companies. That's just a nice example of how what I call the predator state functions.
Now, why are we seeing this dynamic within the United States today?
Oh, because we have the large public institutions, and so they become a target, if you like, an object of interest to major political players. I think that's clear enough. Another big area, of course, is the military budget. We obviously need to have an adequate national security system, but there are all kinds of players here whose object is, who are at least conflicted, and who are advocates of weapon systems which may have no clear relationship to the actual security needs of the country. So you see that. I mean, you just see that in any country in which you have a large government sector and private players who are interacting with the government, you're going to see that kind of dual interest and conflicted interest being at play.
Now, how do you reconcile the predator-state dynamic with calls for government activism? And what I'm basically asking is, won't the predator-state siphon off any gains from government spending to special interests?
Well, it doesn't siphon off all of them, and given how small a number the private sector players actually are, it may not siphon off even a very large fraction of the total flow of benefits. So again, in the case of Medicare Part D, I don't doubt that the drug benefit was of great value to a large part of the elderly population. But as I say, it was designed in such a way that part of that, an excessive part of it, was shared with Big Pharma. So the answer is, it's always going to be a mixed bag. And the way you have to deal with it is to focus on how effectively these programs are run and how focused the benefits are on the population that really deserves to have them. A really nice example of this is proposals to privatize Social Security. Social Security is run, the basic retirement benefit, in an extremely efficient way by federal civil servants who are not very numerous and not that highly paid, and who do an excellent job with the basic information management that's required. If you put that in the hands, if you put the funding of that, the management of the funds in private hands, you would be paying off fund managers and all kinds of people whose income levels are much, much higher, and you would be basically subtracting from the pool of benefits that would be available to the
Now we have to take a very, very quick break, but more when we return with Dr. James Galbraith. Then in today's Big Deal, Ed Harrison and I take on the matter of reckless government spending. And truly, you will not believe where some of your taxpayers' dollars they're going. Truly, truly, you won't believe it. It's kind of disgusting. But as we head to a quick break, here's a look at some of today's closing numbers. Stick around.
Welcome Aaron Aid and Abby Martin, two of the terrific hosts on the RT network.
Boom Bust, it's going to give you a different perspective.
Give me one stock tip.
Oh, never. I'll give you the information, you make the decision.
Tell me about how breaking the set works.
It's a revolution of the mind, it's a revolution of ideas and consciousness.
Are you frustrated with the system?
Yeah, extremely.
Your politics would be described as angry.
I think I'm a strong female.
Are you single?
Talking about the same story doesn't make it news. No softball interviews, no puff pieces, only tough questions right here.
terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that.
I want you to watch what we're about to do because you've never seen anything like this on television.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. My simple mission is to change the globe. I'ma do it with this passion and fire with tone. These ones are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set. Breaking the set. Breaking the set.
Welcome back. We now continue our conversation with University of Texas professor Dr. James Galbraith. I asked Dr. Galbraith whether governments can be rendered involuntarily insolvent.
Not in their own currencies. The risk that a government can run is that the rest of the world may not wish to hold their currency, or their own nationals may not wish to hold it, in which case you'll see depreciation, and that means goods that you import become more expensive, and you experience that as inflation in the domestic economy. So that's a risk. It's a risk which is much more serious for small countries, which are vulnerable to being hit by runs by private investors, than it is to a large country like the United States or Britain or Germany, where fundamentally the players in the economy are going to continue to use the national currency and are going to continue to hold their wealth in assets denominated in that currency. And so the stability of those currencies, they may go up and down some, but it's not deeply at risk from a widespread financial panic.
Now, in Greece, society broke down under austerity, and eventually government debt that was restructured. Is this something that the U.S. and the UK should fear?
The restructuring of the Greek debt was absolutely essential, and indeed inadequate to the purpose of providing some stability, restoring some growth to the Greek economy. Is there any risk that the United States would have to do such a similar restructuring and actually impose an involuntary haircut on the holders of United States Treasury bonds? No risk of that at all. Simply no reason to expect it could ever happen. And the reason is that the Greek government could not pay the interest and principal repayments that were due on debts that were owed in euro, a currency that the Greek government actually has to earn via taxation before it can pay that interest. The U.S. government simply owes its interest in a currency that, in the dollar, which, as we've said, is a fiat currency that the U.S. government itself controls. So all the Congress has to do, and the Congress has done and always will do, is order the Treasury Department to continue paying the interest, and the Treasury Department writes the checks. There is, therefore, no risk that you're going to suffer a capital loss measured in dollars from this.
Right. Now, is there a long-term budget constraint for sovereign currency issuers? Basically, how long can a sovereign government deficit spend before people lose faith in the currency and force default?
In a large country, there is no way that the public can force the government to default. All the public can do is move its assets to another unit, and that again leads to a depreciation. So default is not a threat which is on the table for a large sovereign currency issuers. How long does it take before people lose faith in any significant numbers? In a country like the United States, I think the answer to that is a very long time. The United States can and has run budget deficits for its entire history, with a half a dozen very short-term exceptions. It will continue to run a budget deficit for the rest of its history. The budget deficit at present levels is actually not increasing the ratio of debt to GDP. That debt is stable. Ratio stable is probably declining now. So in the current fiscal stance of the United States government, there's no reason to believe that private investors are going to be leaving the dollar for other currencies for any reason. They haven't done so yet, and there's no cause on the horizon.
We see no reason. That was James Galbraith, economic professor at the University of Texas at Austin. It's time now for today's Big Deal. As always, I'm joined by my doppelganger. No, not really. The one and only Ed Harrison, my favorite, who's going to help me talk today about government misuse, mismanagement, and abuse of funds. So let's get right to it. Now, it's fair to say that no one particularly likes overuse of government funds. And for those who can understand and tolerate the occasional spending inefficiencies, even they know that there must be a line drawn somewhere, anywhere. Now, the federal government is well aware of how wasteful it is, and this is why each and every agency has an inspector general whose sole job, his or her only job, is to investigate and identify government waste within the body that is supposed to investigate and identify waste. Well, anyway, we here at Boom Bust, we decided to investigate some of the more stunning examples of government waste that ends up costing the government, vis-a-vis the taxpayer, tens of billions of dollars a year. Now, here are some of the worst offenses. Check these out. Now, we're starting off here. It's number 5. The Employment and Training Administration failed to track down $148 million in overpaid government checks due to calculation errors. Yes, calculation errors. You know, like when you put in a calculator, that seems like a silly mistake. Now, the Army, on the other hand, they wasted almost $340 million maintaining the Stryker vehicle contract. This is despite having to rebuild over 1,000 of those 8-wheeled armored vehicles due to wear and tear. So clearly they were built well the first time.
We're only talking M's with no B's here.
No B's yet. We're only hitting B's. We'll get to B's, oh, don't you worry. Now, the Department of Health and Human Services, they could have saved 2.7 billion with a B, 2.7 billion if they simply took the time to look at how much Medicaid and Medicare should have been paying for wholesale prescription drugs. Oh, and let's not forget Afghanistan, boy oh boy, where a government watchdog found almost $2 billion in potential waste, fraud, and abuse. Now, this includes the $34 million military facility built just last year that will be unused and vacant. So a big building for $34 million with nothing in it. And finally, and the most egregious and kind of embarrassing to say on television, however I'm going to do it, penis pumps. That's right. Penis pumps. From 2006 to 2011, penis pumps cost the U.S. government $172 million. Fortunately, no B there, but $172 million. That's twice as much as the consumer would have paid at retail value. Now, Ed, to me, the need alone for an inspector general is admission that these bodies are set up to govern stink governing, no?
Well, you know, I have to say, we're definitely going to talk about number 5.
Just give me a second here.
And I'm glad that wasn't a B, but rather an M. But, you know, it goes back to actually, from my perspective, to what James Galbraith was talking about in terms of the predator state. It was interesting, one of his questions that you asked him about, isn't the fact that we have all these people who are trying to get their hands in on government money from the private sector, isn't that going to mean that anytime we spend money, there's going to be waste? And he essentially said, yes, but, you know, we need to be able to come up with ways to spend that money in the most efficient, efficacious way. And that's part of the political process. That was his answer. And I thought that was actually a pretty good answer.
Well, it's obviously a good answer, but the question is, clearly today, as we see it, penis pumps are taking $172 million. It's not working today. No?
No, not at all. And, you know, the interesting bit about this, here, let me go into a little bit of detail about the whole thing of medical device makers, because this was a big deal. Here in D.C., we had a government shutdown, and part of the shutdown, what people wanted to do was to repeal this tax from Obamacare that started in January on medical device makers. Now, the medical device makers have their own lobbyists here in D.C. And part of Obamacare was to say that, we're going to get all these uninsured people. They're now going to be using health care, and therefore this is a windfall to the healthcare industry. So we're going to tax them. We're going to actually, bring some of that money back. And part of that money is going to be on medical device makers, the same people who are making these penis pumps.
You had to say it. I'm so glad you said I wasn't alone in saying it.
So basically, we have the whole nexus here of government spending, taxation, lobbyists, corporatism, whatever you want to call it, all playing a part. And that's how the sausage gets made, in addition to shutdown of government. So, I mean, it's a very messy process, and especially when you have special interests involved in everything that you do.
Everything.
This is what's going to happen.
And Noah, this really kind of leads me to my next thought, and it's the size of these numbers. Let's talk about that. Now, have historically we ever seen, waste on this grand a scale?
Well, my take is that we have seen waste on this grand scale in the sense that as a percentage of GDP, you can't necessarily say that there's more government waste now than there was before. If you recall, back in the 80s, we were talking about, $500 toilet seats and screws, that cost $100. So the scale that we're talking about is in terms of the actual amount of government spending, the scale of GDP, the fact that we're a bigger country, that government is a bigger part of our society. So, as a result, all of these things are going to be larger.
But is that just a different metric on which we're calculating these things? It seems like the same thing, just the bigger the country gets, the more it's going to grow, the more the GDP is going to grow, the more government is going to grow, and the more spending on things that don't need to be spent money on, it's gonna increase. Is that not just the case?
It is. It's definitely the case, and I think that it's a big problem in terms of how people think about the whole concept of economics. Economics isn't just a science. People in economics want to tell you that this is a science, and therefore, we can use all these equations to come up with answers. But the reality is at the end of the day, you have to make policy decisions based on this economics, and that is a political issue.
And a theoretical one at that. As always, you rock. That's all for now, but you can see all segments featured in today's show on YouTube at youtube.com/BoomBustRT. We also love hearing from you, so please check out our Facebook page. Send us messages, say hi, whatever. That's facebook.com/BoomBustRT. You can also tweet at us at Aaron8 and at EdwardNH. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Ciao!